There's another Spider-Man movie coming out, and I guess I don't even have to say the title here. Something like A Bright New Day or something, and really generic, which I think really also speaks about Hollywood Spider-Man um, in general, because it's just so generic and it's beyond nondescript. There's a kind of phony optimism in Hollywood Spider-Man. I keep saying Hollywood Spider-Man because I'm not really that acquainted with the comic book Spider-Man, and I've heard that comic book Spider-Man is something that is a lot more interesting than Hollywood Spider-Man. So when I say Spider-Man, I really mean the movie version of it. Okay, back in the early 2000s, the very first Spider-Man movie that came out, and then they've switched actors something like 3 or 4 times total. Um, and I just don't like Spider-Man. Out of all the comic book figures, right? Like, I, and it's not really about bright versus dark, because I really like Batman. I like Rorschach, although he doesn't really maybe count as a standard, comic book superhero, because Watchmen is a kind of a critique or deconstruction or whatever you want to call it, of the comic book genre. Um, but I like Batman, and I also like Superman. Okay, I generally like those characters. Spider-Man, though, always never really appealed to me. Um, I don't know. I know you don't really watch or pay attention to comic uh, book heroes and such, but uh, I mean, did you ever like any comic book hero before?
Um, Not really, mostly because I grew up in the age where comic books were kind of phased out. Um, I mean, when I was born, the first Spider-Man movie already came out, so I mainly appealed. I mainly gravitated towards, Hollywood at that point.
Yeah. Well, I think the Marvel ones, you could have grown up with, but I guess it just didn't really interest you, right?
Yeah, no.
Yeah. So, I um I think that, when I watch or read, Batman or Superman kind of material, you know, these are kind of coming at things from a different era, right? Or sorry, a different direction. Um, the thing about Spider-Man is that I think the issue with him is that there's just there's a lot of injustices in his life that have more to do not with a big giant supervillain, but really just institutional or structural injustices, right? Like this guy often can barely afford rent. He is barely making ends meet. He's constantly busy. Um, and at the same time, for some reason, he has all this intelligence and he has literal superpowers. And yet he doesn't have the confidence to simply, you know, date the woman that he likes. And again, this is the Hollywood version, right? There's always some kind of um, inability to be with this woman and so forth. So uh, to me, when I look at Spider-Man, what I really see is to use kind of like older slang, I guess, like a beta male. What I mean by beta male is not like somebody who um, is the opposite of somebody who's very aggressive or something. When I say something like beta male or alpha male, um, I try to not use those terms because they're just kind of silly, but they're still in the public circulation. What I really mean is a village worthy. So if you look at Mencius, right, he talks about different kinds of persons, and then there's the village worthy or the conventional townsman. This is a little different from the petty person, the Shaoren. Um, when we have the village worthy, what we're talking about is somebody who sees himself as right, but he just goes along with everybody else, right? He doesn't have an objectively independent sense of right and wrong. Okay, he just kind of does what everybody expects him to do. Okay, and that's Hollywood Spider-Man. You know, so um, in other words, if you're really an intelligent person, right? If you're really so intelligent, you are capable of inventing things and thinking outside the box. and you're interested in questions of justice, right? At some point, you must understand how the larger system works and how that repeatedly and almost invariably leads to injustice. And yet there's no kind of thinking there. And so I think that, you have Spider-Man, and it's almost kind of a way to get young men to basically discard their natural sense of, you know, this is wrong. I have been aggrieved. I'm going to look to see how the system is set up against me. I'm going to question the system, and then I'm going to change the system, right? That's really what should be natural. But you have a character here who doesn't do any of that, right? He literally has the intelligence and the physical ability to do something about it, and he doesn't do that. Okay, so the nature of evil in your world, in the real world, is systematic. It's subtle. It's diffuse, right? Um, you could be a villain and not be a genocidal maniac, right? You don't have to be Hitler. Okay, you could be a villain just simply by having a very loud dog that barks all the time and disturbs your neighbors, right? That's villainous, right? You could just simply, um, be a neglect your family relations in order to make more money or in order to, get drunk, right? You could be the kind of person to basically sleep around and lie to themselves that's what they're doing, right? Um, that's villainous too, right? That's what I mean by subtle and diffuse, right? So every time a Spider-Man movie comes out, it kind of not exactly upsets me, because there's just a lot of junk out there. But it does remind me of the kind of morality that they are always trying to push upon people, right? The kind of morality that makes you think that real evil is some kind of villain that is physically destroying everything in its path. Something that is just exaggerated and comical. Okay. But real villainy and real evil is just very commonplace, and it's institutional and it's systematic, and it comes out in very subtle ways. Um, so, to me personally, I personally like uh, David Lynch works, because it's kind of the opposite, right? There are no, strictly speaking, direct bad guys. Everybody's kind of a bad person, right? There are bad things about every person in these characters, and even if they're not outrightly bad, they can be tempted into doing evil, right? And they, um, fall to those temptations. Okay, so the way that his works look at evil is that it's more pervasive, diffuse, and so forth. And those are also just intellectually and spiritually just more meaningful. So I might do later on. I might do like a mini series on some of his works. Exploring that and such. Um, but to me, something like Spider-Man is very opposite. Why do I still like Batman and Superman above Spider-Man? I think as long as you're going to commit to something, it needs to make sense. You know, like with something like particularly Batman, there is a recognition that there is systematic corruption, right? But Batman is kind of more he more has his hands full dealing with the most um, the most extreme symptoms of that corruption. Okay, so even though the GCPD, right, the Gotham Police, at one point is just corrupt, right? Even though the city overall is falling apart, um, at the end of the day, this is a wealthy man who is fighting crime with his fists, right? There's only really so much he can do, okay? Um, and so he deals with that, and he's dealing with his own kind of emotional turmoil. Um, with Superman, it's a little different again there too, um, where either the threats are really Superman shaped, but like actual good Superman stories um, are not really about getting rid of evil. They're kind of more questions about um, they're more questions about, you have all this power, but what is the right amount of usage of that power? Okay, it's they're more going to be uh, about something else that is simply getting rid of evil, right? Because Superman can easily get rid of evil, and any good Superman story simply accepts that. There's never a question of can he do it. It's more of a question of should he do this or that. All right, and that's a very abstract way to put that. But Hollywood Spider-Man is always going to end up being like, can he beat Doctor Octopus? Right? Can he beat the Green Goblin? It's not a question of like, should given that he has to sacrifice something, what is he going to do? Right? It doesn't really end up being that way, you know. Maybe he is asked to sacrifice, but it's more like, okay, he doesn't have much time for his personal life. He's gonna have to sacrifice that, but that's not really a moral question, you know. So, anyways, that was just kind of uh, just a little fun, diverging from the usual, America's collapsing uh, uh, topics of discussion that we usually talk about. Oh, and here's a little joke that came up a long time ago. You know how the Spider-Mans, right? This kind of newer series, I guess it's called like MCU Spider-Man, but this always has to do with something like home, right? Homecoming, far from home, no way home, right? Um, but with New York getting worse and worse, right, on a daily basis, I was just thinking it'd be kind of funny to have a Spider-Man, right? This is kind of going back to the thing about like comics are actually going to be better, right? Because in those, Peter Parker does get married and that kind of thing, right? He has to kind of live life, not just as sort of like this bachelor who kind of dates just one woman, right? But anyways, if you think about it, right? You're Spider-Man, you're in New York, New York's falling apart, you have kids to raise, they don't have your powers, so you're always worrying about them. So if you were really going to be serious about this, your next title should actually be, instead of something generic like, Brand New Day, it should be Spider-Man, Find a New Home. Because I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to live in New York when I have kids and it's falling apart like that.